Okay, so well, thank you very much for the invitation. This is a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I also wanted to thank Carlos and Andrew for the presentation and for the invitation again, and Jason for having the idea to inviting me here, and also for this very exciting talk that he's given. Actually, I mean, just picking up on some of the ideas that he's given, notions like transition, appropriation through extra economic means, against resource determinism. All these ideas I will be exploring too in my talk, but through a much more, let's say, concrete analysis. In my talk today, I will be talking about my research on energy transitions in the region of southern Catalonia, and I will describe the way local inhabitants in this region have experienced the consequences and engaged with the contradictions of the quote-unquote low-carbon energy transition. Excuse me. Before proceeding on to the content of the talk, I would like to say something about the value of the methodological approach that I will adopt here. This case study is based on long-term ethnographic historical research initiated in 2010, and most of what I explain is included in the book that you have on the screen. The kind of ethnography that I seek to do analyzes capitalist abstractions, for instance, energy or value, with a focus on examining how these abstractions are always embedded with historical, political, and cultural legacies of the place as they come to shape people's livelihoods. The goal of this method, thus, is not to analyze these abstractions, or not only to analyze these abstractions, but also to defetishize them by showing real people doing real things. As I hope to show, there is much to be gained by situating processes of energy transition within specific historical and geographical coordinates. Southern Catalonia, here in the map, is a region of about 200,000 inhabitants that comprises Catalonia's 5 southernmost counties, covering the lower stretch of the river Ebro. It is largely rural, with no sizable towns, and family income is about 20% lower than the Catalan average. The cultivation of Mediterranean commodity crops and the elaboration of related products, olive oil and wine, have historically been the main economic activities in the area. And in the picture, you can see a good example of the kind of landscape that this has produced, as well as some pictures of its processes of transformation. Nowadays, although most households own land and actually cultivate it, mostly on a family basis, farming is very rarely their sole and oftentimes not even their main source of income. The region hosts a large energy infrastructure, and myriad energy projects have arrived to the area since the 1960s, from large hydroelectric dams to wind farms, and from nuclear power plants and waste storage facilities to natural gas power stations, and even more. These projects have coexisted with several governmental plans to transfer water from the Ebro, from the river, to neighboring urban and industrial poles, thus reinforcing the idea that southern Catalonia is an extractive periphery performing functions of tap and sink for the Spanish metabolism. And just to kind of say it now, most of what I will be saying around nuclear happened here in Escó, where you see that there are 2 nuclear reactors, and most of what I will be saying around wind happens in this county here called Terra Alta. Even if my fieldwork extended all over the place, most of it is north of Terra Alta and Escó. Since the 1960s, southern Catalonia has worked as an energy frontier, playing a key role in the adoption of 2 forms of low-carbon electricity production. First, it was at the center of a nuclear transition, this is how it was called at the moment, that was enthusiastically embraced by Spain's government and the electrical corporations, hosting 4 of the 10 nuclear reactors that were built in the country during the 1970s and 80s, and 3 of the 7 that are still in operation. Second, since the turn of the century, southern Catalonia has been at the vanguard of the very notable development of wind energy in Spain, which has positioned the country and some of its corporations as renewable energy leaders worldwide. As you can see on the slide, this growth was especially strong in the years leading to the housing bubble, and it became afterwards a refuge for investors. And then it stopped and it has picked up very recently again. To kind of give a sense of how this goes. Both nuclear and wind account for approximately 20% of the electricity produced in the country, as you can see here. This is wind and this is nuclear, 22% in 2019. This layered history of energy transformations is theoretically and politically relevant. Indeed, low carbon energy transitions tend to take place in places like southern Catalonia. That is to say, predominantly rural, with low population density and low real estate value, depressed economies, and located in the periphery of major industrial and population centers. This means that the outcome of the low carbon energy transition is largely being played in these areas, or to express it in more conceptual terms, that the existing processes of energy transition rely on specific geographies of unevenness. In this respect, the fact that all energy projects, including especially wind and nuclear, have been met with intense local opposition in the region, makes the Southern Catalan case particularly interesting. Before continuing, I would like to enter two caveats. First, that as Jason said, there's no energy transition, to put it bluntly. Well, this is something that if you are a Southern Catalan, you know it, because you look around yourself and you see that there's just an accumulation, there's just an addition of more and more energy facilities. You look around and you see nuclear plants, you see hydro dams from the 60s, you see natural gas power plants, you see oil refineries, etc. So this is again one of the beauties of a place-based analysis. The second caveat is that I must admit that personally, I find it hard to include nuclear power next to renewables when it comes to a low carbon energy transition. However, a growing numbers of voices on the left suggest that nuclear is necessary for this transition. Due to time restrictions, and given that I will concentrate on the process of wind development, I won't be able to delve into the nuclear case as it would deserve. Yet to compensate for that, I will offer a brief comparison of the two processes, the arrival of nuclear and the arrival of wind. The arrival of nuclear and then wind energy had deep yet contrasting effects upon the livelihood practices and political strategies of the inhabitants of southern Catalonia. Due to their different historical contexts in which they arrived and their different organizational characteristics, they afforded a different range of livelihood strategies to southern Catalans, while also affecting the shape and intensity of local forms of resistance. Now, here in this table, I try to put together some of these forms of resistance as they emerge with nuclear and wind. I'll go through them pretty quickly. Both in the case of nuclear and wind, the resistance can be divided into two kinds. On the one hand, organized forms of opposition of a more or less explicit political character. And here we can see that in the case of nuclear, there's a strong correspondence. In the case of nuclear, the struggle against the nuclear plants was very much understood as a struggle against the corporate and authoritarian structure of Franco's state. Whereas now what we see very much around wind and other struggles is a struggle against the area being tap and sink for a wasteful metabolism built around tourism, real estate, etc. In the case of nuclear, there was a strong effort to it was understood the struggle as a struggle against an internal colonialism. Nowadays, the language of colonialism has disappeared, but there's very much a language of it being a struggle against the city-county division and very much the rural abandonment, or the abandonment of the countryside. At the same time, for nuclear, it was very much framed as a defense of primary activities, seeing nuclear as a risk for agriculture and fishing. Nowadays, what we see very much is a defense of what it's called in the area endogenous economic development, i.e. an economic development that can rely on endogenous resources, by which I mean agriculture, the landscape, rural tourism, transformation of products, etc. At the same time, at the time of nuclear, the main demand was a demand for renewables. Nowadays, the demand is a demand for a different energy model. The people that protest against wind are always clear that they are not against wind, and the latest motto is renewables, yes, but not like this. So it's not so much the what, but the how. And they demand basically a kind of energy model that promotes conservation, less energy use, and a closer proximity between production and consumption, things like that. Now, next to these forms of organized opposition, and I've showed this continuity, we find that what we could call everyday forms of resistance, often more difficult to gauge, but perhaps more interesting. And these are the ones that I focus on, and today especially. In this respect, we can see that whereas in the case of nuclear power, this everyday resistance tended to focus on issues of labor and salaries, in the case of wind, it has tended to focus on the value of land and the local territory. And these struggles are often framed in the language of dignity. The different organizational characteristics and labor requirements of these two forms of electricity generation play a key role in explaining this divergence. To put it succinctly, whereas the availability of cheap and presumably poorly organized labor was a key factor motivating the location of nuclear power plants in southern Catalonia, and continues to be functional to their operation, wind developers seek spaces that can be cheapened. That is to say, treated as lacking in economic value and moral worth. In the nuclear case, the preference for southern Catalonia was due to a combination of geographical and social considerations. On the one hand, we find the availability of water necessary to cool the reactors, and the region's low population density, which was to minimize the risk in case of a nuclear accident. Yet on the other hand, it also obeyed to a desire to find in the presumed conservatism and apoliticism of the rural population, cheap labor force and a safe haven away from the proliferating unrest in metropolitan areas. In short, nuclear development was an attempt to develop a new industrial frontier, and during the construction phase offered a massive amount of quite well-paid jobs, or very well-paid jobs at that point, although I'll say more on that. However, the passivity of the local population turned out to be a poor calculation. And as I said, anti-nuclear opposition was widespread in the region. This created a series of contradictory effects that I don't have time to describe in detail, but I will mention just two. First, the combination of anti-nuclear opposition and nuclear jobs turned Southern Catalans into unruly transitory nuclear workers who understood themselves as anti-nuclear peasants. In turn, this subjectivity was grounded in material conditions, i.e. in the possibility of partially investing the abundant nuclear salaries into the farming economy of local households and community projects. Now, the fact that these salaries were so high was in part due to the unruliness of the labor force, and I don't have time to enter into that. But however, the second point that I want to make, once the nuclear plants opened and jobs dried up, the nuclear plants were able to use their financial might and monopoly over sources of income to control the political process in the village of Ascó, where the two main reactors are located, and eliminate political opposition and even the memory of the anti-nuclear struggle. Now I'll move on to wind. In Spain and elsewhere, wind energy development has tended to focus on poor rural areas. But the preference for these areas has nothing to do with the aim of opening a new industrial frontier. Developers prefer these areas because in them, land values tend to be lower, but also because the lack of voice and the neediness of its inhabitants help developers overcome local opposition, foment internal divisions, and negotiate land leases. Poor rural areas offer still an added advantage to wind developers. They help legitimize wind farms as intrinsically good, as we can see in the following quote from a medium-sized wind developer operating in southern Catalonia. Wherever I go to develop, I find poverty. Windy places tend to be remote, places that have suffered a population exodus for the last 150 years. Villages whose budget do not even allow the people to live minimally decently. And with wind energy, we have offered a way to earn money. Old people saw that when the youngsters visited in the summer, they could organize a decent fiesta, a nice swimming pool for their grandchildren. I have seen a lady cry, several ladies and gentlemen who could barely make a living with their pension, and suddenly they get a turbine and an annual rent. Land here in Catalonia is bad enough. And suddenly in a corner, they get a turbine. So you save that family which could not face their old age from something, the land from which they got nothing, just expenses. Notice that in order to highlight how beneficial these wind farm projects are for the local population, the developer needs to depict the Terra Alta county as, of southern Catalonia in this case, as a wasteland, a place with no value, cursed by poverty and isolation, which can only be redeemed through the action of enlightened entrepreneurs like himself. Yet the developer's description of Terra Alta's low value as something he just found out there is disingenuous, for it conceals the myriad discursive, legal, and material mechanisms employed by developers with the crucial aid of the state to devalue the region, and more specifically, its land and territory and the livelihoods it supports. That is to say, developers do not so much look for cheap places as for places that can be cheapened, a concept that I take from Jason Moore. Cheapening is twofold. One is a price movement. This is a Jason's quote. To reduce the costs of working for capital directly and indirectly. Another is ethico-political, to cheapen in the English language sense of the word, to treat as unworthy of dignity and respect. Cheapening, thus, includes devaluation as well as what they call disvalorization, a notion that I borrow from Harry Cleveland. Through disvalorization, local livelihood practices and the cultural forms through which the territory is managed, as well as place-based forms of historical consciousness and experience, are not only rendered valueless, but also framed as an obstacle for the valorization of land and nature that must be overcome. The disvalorized cultural logic must be replaced by the logic of capital. Once a place, together with the reproductive strategies and forms of historical consciousness that conform it, has been cheapened, i.e. construed as a wasteland, rendered inconsequential, developers can present themselves as the saviors that will valorize the region, separating place from existing practices and imposing their cultural frameworks and valuations. I shall thus describe some of these practices of cheapening as they unfolded in Terra Alta. Some minimal background is needed. In this county, several wind developers, most of them Catalan medium-sized companies, signed agreements with municipalities to develop wind farms at the beginning of the century. Quite immediately, they joined forces to build a 40-kilometer electric line to connect the future plants to wind farms with a high-voltage electric network. And they found a strong opposition from the landowners who quite massively rejected the rights of past contracts offered by the companies. You can see here like some of the paintings of telling they're still there, saying, do not sign. In this context, the companies engaged in a series of practices of cheapening. First, they commissioned a team of economists to produce a report which described the country as a basket case or a wasteland, stagnant agriculture, weak industrial fabric, looming threat of unemployment, etc. The only solution for the county, the study concluded, was to attract outside investment. And this investment were the wind farms. Notice that this goes against the discourse of those opposing wind farm development, who emphasized that economic development had to rely on endogenous resources, wineries, agriculture, rural tourism, etc. The construction of the area as a wasteland was reinforced by the developers in their negotiating tactics with landowners, especially in their banal repetition of expressions like, take the money, you will never make as much from this land, and you will be able to buy presents for your grandchildren. Or, okay, we can maybe pay you a bit more, but we're doing you a favor because this land is not worthy, and so on and so forth. Indeed, in construing the area as a wasteland, Terra Alta was depicted, borrowing from Stefania Barca, as a form of not yet realized value to be appropriated and improved upon by the master. The reference to the master is indeed apposite, for the local population will soon start complaining that the wind developers, quote, have become the new masters. This expression makes more sense when we look at the second cheapening mechanism, expropriation. Relying in part on the study that I described above, the companies requested the Catalan government to declare the electric line to be in the public interest. With this designation, the state could invoke eminent domain at the company's request, expropriating the land needed to build the electric line. With this designation in hand, the company sent a second, lower offer to those landowners who had rejected the first one. If they did not accept it, they would be expropriated. Most accepted. Later on, the companies replicated the strategy when they started negotiating with landowners for the actual wind farms. The third cheapening mechanism has to do with the company's ability to shape, maintain, and administer the local territory. The careless trespassing of land on land parcels, the impossibility to negotiate the terms of the land agreements, the threats to move turbines to neighboring fields, the insidious suspicion of nepotism, and the neglectful destruction of elements of dry stone architecture all contributed to undermining local sense of control over their environment. But the complaint that the wind companies had become the new masters also referred to their ability to control the social and political life of the villages. On the one hand, this refers to the tight grip they had upon the municipalities that had signed agreements, which were unable to renegotiate the terms of the agreements and thus create paths for the resolution of the brewing conflicts in their villages. I could observe these conflicts in the village of Catalonia, where they emerged inside households, and more importantly, between households and groups of kin, which became visible, for instance, in arguments over the precise border of neighboring properties. The developers' strategy for accessing land contributed to these clashes. Indeed, the company started to negotiate the land leases for the turbines, while the expropriation procedures for the electric line were still ongoing. In so doing, the developer pitted two kinds of landowners against each other, creating a rift between the lucky ones that got a turbine, receiving in exchange an annual rent of about 5,000 to 8,000 euros, and the unlucky ones who had to cope with the associated infrastructure, ditches, roads, and so forth, receiving in exchange a far more modest one-off payment. To make the sale more attractive, the company offered advanced cash payments. Those favored with a turbine saw some co-villagers' resistance to the project as a threat to their revenue. This gave rise to all sorts of dirty maneuvering, nurturing conflict and mistrust within the village, fueling old enmities and creating new ones, intensifying factionalism, antagonizing neighbors and kin. Locals use a very specific expression to describe the infighting that took place. The village became forest. Indeed, the expression "to become forest" is used to describe any social product that has lost direction and cohesion. A field laying waste, an abandoned agrarian landscape, a household losing its property and its name, or, as in this case, a village consumed by insidious infighting. Both the physical and social environments of the village had gotten out of control of the local population, appearing to their eyes as disorganized. Perhaps the developer was right, perhaps them and their land were actually waste. And in this picture, maybe you can see the idea that I want to express here, that very much agriculture, making a livelihood is a task of keeping, let's say, the forest at bay. This is how agriculture is locally understood, and therefore the expression. And just to conclude, I'll say a few words on the idea of dignity. The erosion of self-esteem among the local population is of one piece with wind developers' efforts to devalue the region in order to overcome and defeat local resistance. This is clear in the written documents that many of the expropriated landowners presented to the judge during the legal act of occupation that culminated in the process of expropriation. The tenor of these documents can be appreciated in the following quote, extracted from a complaint filed in 2010 by a carpenter and medium-sized farmer in his early 50s. The affected area should be valued not only as a certain number of square meters, but as a land that has been built and forged over many generations. Its moral and immaterial value does not have a price. They have humiliated us, telling us that they were doing us a favor by giving us money for a land that had no value. Forgetting that our land is much more than just square meters, forgetting that this land has been made with our blood. People's dignity should be respected. This quote illustrates that the resistance against wind farm development is a struggle against moral and economic cheapening. This is clearly contained in the demand of dignity. This demand contains a negative dimension, a fiery reaction against passively accepting the denial of one's own dignity. And also a positive one, an assertion of dignity, understood as work, for it claims the value of southern Catalan land linked to the work of many generations. The local demand for dignity is part of a struggle to establish an order of elements conducive to the reproduction of the community and its individuals in front of a series of forces that introduce disorder, that construct the community and its people as waste. The demand for dignity thus is not only the vindication of a landscape made of past labor, but also a bet on the possibilities for the future. And it helps reproduce a resistant subjectivity that is key for the reproduction of livelihoods on the land. The quotidian struggle for dignity emerges out of a need to defend a sense of self-respect, to control one's own environment, and to assert the value of local land that is intimately tied to resistant forms of subjectivity that are integral to the reproduction of local livelihoods. This quotidian struggle thus aims to defend local autonomy in environmental practices. Its main political significance, however, must be found in its resistance to cheapening, a process that lubricates the successive appropriation of the socio-ecological surpluses that fuel capitalism. In aiming to counter this cheapening, this struggle denounces and combats, however precariously, patterns of uneven development and opens up the possibility to politicize and make visible energy production and to envisage alternative energy futures not predicated upon unevenness and regional peripheralization. Thank you.